But there's always that element. Which of your children understands and values what you're giving them? And you see, this is the challenge which this is why God's kingdom has been lost. Because these difficult choices, parents just, think about, oh, I don't want to make this choice, it's too difficult. Let's just not make the choice and just divide it up equally. But deciding to do that is also making a choice. Either way, you're making a choice. You can choose to create your lineage, your sovereignty, a certain way, or to destroy the sovereignty of your children in a certain way. Now, people here who are not parents, who are the children, when they hear this and they think about it, they say, oh, so unfair. And what is that comment, so unfair? What is that? That is the underlying foundation of what? Satan's kingdom. When your kids say, oh, that is so unfair, they're basically saying, I want to use force to destroy what you're doing. Because I think I should get some. Right? Yeah. Which is the basis of socialism. If you don't give it to me, I'm going to take it. Whether you like it or not. So, in that case, when one of your kids say that, what do you have to say? It's very clear what the sovereign has to say. No, you're not. And if you try to take it by force, I'm gonna whack you. I can defend myself. I can defend my castle. And that's why you have to be strong as a sovereign. You have to have the means and the will to defend your kingdom. And so that brings us into when we start with the free will, when we start with free speech, when we start with freedom of religion, if we have those freedoms, if you're a sovereign, automatically the freedoms go to the next requirement, which is if you got freedom and you're building your wealth and you're keeping the stuff that you make, then you have to be able to keep others from taking it from you, which is the freedom of self-defense. So you see, these things are not independent of each other. These natural rights, which men and women have looked at over the centuries and have said, these are the gifts from God, are not something which is just made up out of thin air because it sounds good or because we want to have guns. These rights are required to have as an entire package, because without the other rights, you're not going to keep the basic right of conscience. Well, when you let the state defend you, basically you're opening the door for the state to now take away your freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and your stuff. Because once the state defends you, you don't have the means to protect your stuff from other people. Because now the state can come in and say, I want your stuff. And what can you say to the state? You can't say anything because you have no means to defend yourself. That is a revolutionary principle. And that principle is basically what we're talking about as the biblical economics, the economics of Jesus Christ. the economics of even the Lord of Second Advent. And that economic principle was very clearly presented. I get to keep the stuff that comes from my own labor. That's what it means. I work for it, I make it, I get to keep it. And that's the problem. If I'm very productive and I make a lot of stuff and I accumulate a lot of stuff, I'm going to have a lot more than everybody else. Then the people who are lazy bums are going to come to my house and say, I'm going to take some of your stuff because you got so much and I don't. And if you don't have a gun, they'll take it. So when you look at biblical principles of the right to work, the right to keep the fruits of your labor, it's a biblical principle actually to have the right to defend your labor and your work and your person. Which means it's a biblical principle that you have the right to kill. I'm not making this stuff up. It's all related to each other. And so that's going to be the challenge. You may have been very successful in your life in accumulating wealth or whatever, whether it's spiritual wealth or physical wealth. But if you're not successful in transferring it to the next generation, your work's going to disappear. Well, just look at Father. He has a lot of spiritual wealth. All the people who loved and followed him throughout his entire ministry. So his wealth wasn't just physical. It was basically the love of the people, the reputation. And a lot of people in public office have that kind of wealth. Like, if you look at the politicians, they have their name value. And so their kids who run for their office are running on the political wealth of their parents. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing. The kingdom of God is a kingdom of sovereigns. So not only political dynasties, but economic dynasties. And that's the problem. We should have lots of middle-class dynasties. But we don't because of the way the laws are structured right now in the country. And so when we talk about God's kingdom, we're talking about the greatest amount of sovereignty for the greatest number of people. And basically, that nation can be constructed based upon, the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution, but also by the reflection of how the laws are played out on the books. If the Constitution and the practice of lawmaking in a nation is able to be pursued in a manner in which large concentrations are prevented, then you're going to have a society with a very wide distribution of middle class. And then if you're able to create a society in which you're able to inherit the wealth the middle class makes to the next generation, then you're going to have what you call an intergenerational middle class. A relatively broad intergenerational middle class. And that is what we're talking about when we're talking about the kingdom of heaven on earth. We're talking about a kingdom and a nation in which you have these rights of inheritance, not just for, the few aristocratic families like you have in this world, but for like 30% of the population. Well, in any type of society, the owners, if you're able to remove all the impediments to competition and to remove all the regulations and the bureaucracies, then the most, at any time, the most amount of owners for businesses and resources in that nation will probably be about 30% of the population. Will be able to be some kind of business owner, from small to mid-sized to large business. Because you're going to have people growing up who are not yet qualified to be in the workforce, people leaving the workforce, people retiring. So the 30% is about the largest you can get. And so the real spectrum in the country between ownership and dictatorship is going to be between one person owning all the resources of that country up to about 30% of it. People being some kind of business owner. And so what we're trying to do when we talk about God's kingdom from a practical sense, when we talk about creating God's kingdom, is we're talking about how do we structure the laws so that we get the maximum number of business owners in the nation. And that's what the Constitution of Chanuguk is designed or sketched around producing. Trump is definitely moving in that kind of direction. But, as we study the Constitution of Chanuguk and as we discuss God's kingdom is not just something which is an idea, which is far away, which has just been the dream of all those crazy religious fanatics throughout history. No, God's kingdom can be constructed through our understanding, not of law, politics, economics, society structures. It is a real and practical kingdom that can actually be constructed. And it is a kingdom in which we can actually build a model of and forecast how that will affect the people in that society. It is not a kingdom which is illusory or far away or idealistic or something which is unattainable. It is completely attainable to us today if we have the will to construct it. And that's the important point to understand. That's the important distinction that we need to make.
It is also said that the kingdom of God is in your heart, right?
Yes, the kingdom of God is already here. We just need to make it.
It just takes wholeness and integrity of the person.
Well, the kingdom of God has always been very simple. The precept of the kingdom of God is what Father talked about. It's conscience. It's free will. Free will in pursuit of happiness. And what is happiness? It's to be in love. With who? With your Creator.
With your Creator.
But those simple words and those simple concepts actually have a fundamental and profound ramification on how the society is constructed. If we follow the principles of free will and of conscience and of sovereignty and of inheritance, then that creates a very distinct society. In terms of all aspects of the society. Its economic structure, its legal structure, its political structure, its military structure, its coercive structure. And so this is a transition that we need to start thinking about. How do we move our community from being a very isolated, highly devoted community, religious community, to becoming an actual nation? A nation of God's idea. Well, there has to be a transition in the way we think a little bit. Because, as a religious community which had to go into the wilderness after Christianity rejected Father, you had to basically be like an army, special forces. But when the rules which you have of, let's say, being an elite force in an army are going to be very rigid. And the standards to become part of that elite force is going to be very high. But then when you look at the standards and the requirements for the regular army, what are it? It's lower. It's not as hard, but it's still rigid for an army. But now let's take that society well, you're going from the special forces to the regular army, but now let's go to civilian. Are you going to have the same rules for your civilian population as you do for your army? Are the standards going to be lower or higher? Right. So now we have to think about how we can live in a society where we're creating laws and governance and applying our understanding of God's will to a civilian population. Pass the mic down.
Okay. Oh, good. It's been asked before when we started speaking about this, how does it become the logistical reality for us as a small community? What do we do interrelationally that we start building those foundational building blocks for a kingdom of heaven on earth? And I know one of the things you mentioned was learn to hunt and fish, and also learn to farm and become self-reliant.
Well, we're talking about those things now, aren't we?
Yeah.
Because we're talking not only of being self-reliant, and self-reliance, whether it's hunting or fishing or procuring resources for your own family, that's basically keeping the fruits of your labor. But we've been talking about how you're going to inherit that accumulated wealth when you go to the next life. And that's really the big challenge of a sovereign or a king, is how you pass on your work, your life, to your next generation. And so your work and your life are not necessarily just the material things you accumulated. Your work and your life are your pursuit of God's kingdom too, in one regard.